Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL week number 7 overview and analysis video. First of all, thank you so much for sticking around for this. This video is pretty late. It was supposed to come out a couple of days ago, and that means we've basically gotten through week 8. Rest assured, I have not seen any of the games. I've tried to look up as little of the results as possible, of course, seeing stuff on Twitter here and there, but, I really have tried to stay away before I'm able to make this video because I want this to be a week 7 overview and not have any sort of week 8 bias start to bleed in to what I'm talking about. But today we are going to be going over the penultimate week here in the NACL, the second to last week before we hit the playoffs in the NACL. I'm very excited. Hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. Again, what teams are really impressing you and what teams aren't. We're getting to the point where that cutoff is starting to become much more important, where you just do not want to be bottom 2. You cannot be a team that is in the bottom of the standings. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how things end up shaking out, but I would love to know who you think's going to get in, who you think might make some noise, who you think's on, good pace and good form. I would just love to know your thoughts on the league up until this point. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on every week before this, you can check out the NACL playlist up in the iCard right now. We've done every single week of NACL action, but today we're going to be talking about week number 7. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of each team in that series. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover. And at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything up in this week in a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my power rankings at the end of the video from number 1 to number 10. And like I said, with only one more week after this being played as we speak, there's a lot on the line when it comes to actually, getting that high power ranking number, looking like you're in good form, being in a position to actually be able to take one of those higher tier playoff spots that are kind of open right now. It's not like this league is settled by any means outside of perhaps the top 3. So without further ado, let's jump right into day number 1. We've got 3 days of action, 2 series each day. That means 6 series to cover in total. And kicking off day number 1 was one that I was super, super excited to see. A clash of, some former players and their former org. It was Supernova taking on Cincinnati Fear, and Cincinnati Fear picking up a huge victory in this one. I did not see this coming. Supernova is one of the teams that I was considering in that upper echelon, the top 3, if you will, of FlyQuest, Maryville, and Supernova so far this split. But, Fear kind of punching their way into that conversation. Their loss to Team Liquid last week obviously didn't, dampen their spirits too much because they come out firing at the beginning of this one and really are just able to dominate. And it's off the back of a mid laner that, everybody thought had potential. Maybe some people thought it would take a little bit of time for him to get used to the NACL. He's been awesome this entire split. That mid laner being, of course, my player of the series, Toasty for Fear. He was incredible in this series, really consistent across both of their wins. The Hui game, the Orianna game were both game-breaking. I mean, he was amazing in game 1. I think the Hui was really what opened up the map for Fear and allowed them to play a lot more aggressive towards the beginning of this series. And then, obviously, they were a little bit more versatile, I would say. Everybody kind of got a piece of the pie in game number 3 when things just kind of started going right. I think a lot more of the team was on comfort in that third game, and Toasty was still really good on the Orianna. You could argue that he was the most important member of that game as well. I mean, it's just really good stuff coming in from him. He has exceeded my expectations in basically every way. He has been one of the, 2, 3 to 4 best mid laners in the NACL, and that's huge for year number 1. He's a big reason why this team is sitting where they are. I know they really haven't played a lot of games, and they're going to play another one this week. They're going to have to get their backloaded schedule kind of rocking and rolling soon, but the games that they have played, the 7 series that they played, Toasty's been pretty good in almost all of them, and especially in the ones they've won. I think you could, very confidently say that 3 out of the 4 series that they've won, he's been the best player for this team, which is super, super impressive to say for somebody whose first split is is right now in the NACL. So really good stuff from Toasty. I think the entire team played well. Credit to Lens and Daption. They're just very consistent down in the bot lane. I think Daption does a really good job switching up his style. He's been playing mostly Enchanters for a lot of this year, but going to some more Engagers here, exclusively Engagers, the Nautilus, the Maokai, the Rakan, as they become a little bit more meta, he's really good on those too. And Lens is very good at capitalizing on the things that are given to him. He doesn't necessarily need to be the most aggressive AD carry in this system because he does have a very aggressive jungle, a very aggressive mid lane, and, Daption, who is going to be a bit more of a playmaker in the way that he plays the game. And so Fear's actually set up really well to let Lens just kind of do his own thing, and I think it works out well for them. Philip was very good on the top side of this map. Credit to Faisal. I think both of them actually played well. Both top laners were pretty good in this series, but Chad also really good facilitator. Wasn't quite as good in game number 2 on the Viego that they ended up dropping, but, for the most part, Chad was also very good. But really, the takeaway for Fear for me is just how good Toasty is. It is a team effort. I don't want it to seem like I'm just trying to single single out one player and say that all their success is because of him. I've said in multiple, overviews the last couple of weeks that this really is a team and they really play above their weight because they all play together very well. But Toasty really is somebody that I'm looking at as like a breakout star in the NACL this year. And hopefully he can continue this momentum as the games do get a little bit more serious. We're getting into the playoff territory. Really interesting to see how that goes. But for Supernova, a little bit of a frustrating loss. They've always kind of been the number 3 in the league so far this year with FlyQuest and Maryville really dominating all the series that they've played. Supernova, to their credit, has not lost to anybody not named Maryville, and they've not played FlyQuest yet so far this year, but here is that first loss to somebody not in the top 2. It's Fear. You would have loved to see Faisal and Shochi have that big kind of comeback series against Fear, that revenge series against the org that they played for last year, but it just didn't quite happen. I think there were moments where both of them looked very good, Shochi in particular in the win in game number 2, and honestly, he was okay in game number 1 on the Syndra as well, but his game number 3 was pretty brutal on the Yone. He was given a lot of resources and just wasn't really able to do much with them. It wasn't entirely his fault. It was a really rough circumstance to be in. I don't want to blame him entirely. I don't think he was the worst player of the series or anything like that. That unfortunate honor, the dud of the series, is going to go to Kenvi, which is really unfortunate to say because he has been on ridiculous pace so far this split. He's been, at worst, I think a top 2 jungler in the league. I think it's been him and Shaden kind of fighting it out for that number 1 spot. Yuji's in that conversation as well, but him and Shaden have both been very good, and Kenvi, I think, has been the driving force for Supernova's offense over the course of this split, and unfortunately, the Lee Sin game number 1 was just really bad. He got no pressure, really was just outplayed by the Volibear and the Hui in the mid lane, and just couldn't actually get a lot going, and it lost them that game pretty early on, and then he wasn't particularly relevant the rest of this series. You can say that he wasn't the worst down the stretch, but I think game 1 was probably the worst game anybody had for Supernova in this series, even if you can talk about, Array getting constantly, abused, I would say, in game number 3. Not entirely his fault, again, just a lot of resources going his way, and him not really being able to do much of it on Kalista, but, Supernova had their problems in this series, and I think it goes to show that, they are probably an upper tier team, and they're very consistent, and one loss isn't going to make me lose all the confidence in this team, but maybe there is a bigger gap of the top 2, and then, everybody else, when you're talking about, like, Supernova and Fear and Team Liquid, then there is, like, a top 3. I still think Supernova's going to be fine. I still expect this team to be a title contender as we move forward. They've obviously got their big series next week against FlyQuest. Have not seen how that has gone, so, that'll be interesting, but at least for now, this is not the loss that I think they wanted to see going into this week. It's certainly not a season-ending loss or anything like that. They're still in a very good position, but you would have liked to see them win this series. And then for Fear, they just keep punching above their weight. They just keep winning series that I don't think a lot of people are expecting them to win. And players like Toasty, players like Chad, players like Lens and Dabshin are just outperforming the expectations that a lot of analysts had for them at the beginning of the season. It's really good stuff. Fear is very much solidifying themselves as an interesting team that I don't think anybody's going to want to play in the playoffs, and I think that's a very good spot for them right now. And then moving on to our second game of day number 1, our second series, and it's 2 teams with 1 series win apiece. It's Mirage Alliance taking on Disguised, and DSG gets a super important, much-needed victory here, 2-0. Mirage obviously has not been able to string together anything consistent at all this year. This team has just never looked like even remotely the sum of their parts. Some of these players, I think, have regressed as the year has continued to go on. Some have started to find footing, but I still don't think this is a very good team, and I think that was showcased here. But DSG finally putting together a confidence-reassuring win. At least they're not one of the worst teams in the league. I think this shows, and we'll see later this week, obviously, with another very important series for them, that they still have more in the tank to not be one of the bottom teams in the NACL, because, record-wise, they are a bottom 2 team. They're out of the playoffs going into this week, and so they needed a victory like this, and they were able to pick it up here. So good stuff from them. Player of the series for me was actually very difficult between the 2 topside members of the team here. I'm going to give it to Tenacity because it felt like he was making more of the eye-grabbing plays, but Perry was also really, really good, and he really was the one setting up Tenacity for a lot of the plays. You can argue that he was more valuable to the team, but I think Tenacity was also very, very good in this series, and honestly, those are the 2 players that you wanted to see step up and you wanted to see dominate. As much as I love Young and Manui and Poom, a lot of the optimism for me surrounding this team going into this year was Tenacity and Perry on the same team. Tenacity, who is so good in lane and is so mechanically dominant, being able to just win on his own on the top side, and Perry being able to, snowball games out of control as well as he did last year. That was a really interesting combination for me, and we haven't really seen those 2 in particular link up and really be as much of a problem, but they were in this series, both of them kind of doing the things that I was hoping to see from them in 2024. Tenacity was great on the TF and on the Aatrox. I think you could argue the Aatrox game was a tad bit better in terms of just being able to take over, but Twisted Fate was still really, really good. Really liked what he was able to do there. Game 1, though, Perry was everywhere. Volibear feels like a very strong pick right now. I mean, like, he's had a couple of games in the LCS as well over the past couple of weeks, and he has just looked dominant in basically everywhere that he's been played. Obviously, that champion goes through fluctuations, but it looked very good for Perry in this moment. Perhaps it's the player and not the champion, though. He was also very good on Vi. I want to make that clear. He was also very impactful on Vi in game number 2. It was Tenacity and Perry that stood out to me, but credit to Manui and Poom. I actually really find game 1 draft interesting for DSG because you've got the TF on the top side, you've got the Taliyah in the mid lane, the Hui in the bot lane. You're really kind of indexing in this very interesting style, and I do think they executed on it well, and it does play, I think, to these players' strengths who want to play for more side lane action, for more macro-oriented action. I think that actually helped them. It allowed Poom to be a little bit more important on the Senna, and I think that actually does a lot for this team. So pretty good draft from them. They went more standard, obviously, in game 2, but I think Poom in general was really good here. Manui is obviously very good when he's comfortable. Even if Hui wouldn't be something that I would recommend for this particular draft in game number 1, I think obviously just getting him on something that he's comfortable playing, getting that confidence back, that's really all I've been saying about DSG. We know these players are talented. We know they're very good at the game. It just feels like their confidence has been sapped over the last couple of weeks of not being able to win. But overall, yeah, very good series for DSG, and not a good one for Mirage. This is just not a good team. They are bottom 1 right now in the NACL, and I think that became even more abundantly clear when they weren't even able to really contest this series. The games weren't blowouts, or at least game 1 was actually pretty close. Prismal was very strong on the Kai'Sa. They just weren't able to get the job done. I think there were moments where perhaps if Will plays a bit better on the Xin Zhao, perhaps if he's, has a little bit more impactful engages, you could do things. I think RJS was also a little bit lackluster down the stretch on the Tristana, but game number 2 just kind of fell out of their graces super fast. You can honestly point to basically everybody in game 2, but I'm going to give Dead of the series to Dardoch, mostly for that Blitzcrank game. I think he was the only player who was bad in both games, even if he wasn't the worst in either. Like, Alorum got absolutely destroyed in game number 2 on the Renekton. He's not been very good at all for Mirage this year, unfortunately. Been a weak side top laner, has never really received resources, and isn't winning. Isolated in his lane, which is not a good combination, but I think, Dardoch was probably the only player I could say across both games was not making nearly as many plays as I would like to see. And honestly, I've not been a fan of how Dardoch has played this split. I liked him coming up from tier 3. I actually thought he was really good in the qualification playoff, but we're just not seeing that version of him right now. It feels like him and Prismal don't have great chemistry together as a bot lane duo. And going up against actual good bot lanes with Poom actually playing well and topside losing, there just wasn't a lot that he could get done specifically on that blitz. Again, Prismal actually had a good game on Kai'Sa. He's kind of been the player that I've been the most disappointed by on this team so far this year because I was so high on Prismal and he's not played well at all, but he had a good Kai'Sa game, couldn't really do anything on Smolder. RJS continues to be fine, if a little bit over-aggressive. Will continues to be fine, if a lot of bit over-aggressive, and Alorum isn't particularly good on the top side, and that's a recipe for the 10th place team in the NACL. When you basically got every other team in the league having some interesting course, something that is really exciting to be able to play around, it just doesn't feel like Mirage has that right now, so unfortunately, that's their position after week number 7 going into the final week. But for DSG, their week is not over. They have another matchup that they need to win down the stretch of this week, but at least for now, this is a really good way to start week number 7 and the easier part of your schedule. And now moving on to day number 2, our middle day of the week, and we get a pretty interesting matchup. Top 4 teams, in my opinion. Team Liquid Challengers taking on Maryville University, and Maryville is going to pick up the win here, cementing that top 2 as the top 2. As much as I'd love to make it a top 3, a top 4, a top 5 because of how well a lot of teams in the NACL are playing, it just feels like FlyQuest and Maryville are on a bit of a different playing field right now when it comes to the continued success that they've been able to have, the consistency that these two teams have been able to have. It's very impressive stuff. Not to discount Team Liquid, I think they've gotten themselves back into a relatively good position after what was a really rough start to the year. I'm still not super sold on this team, just as I'm not super sold on the LCS version of this team, but I think both of them are going to land in pretty similar situations come the end of the regular season. Both relevant teams that you're just hoping are going to get better as the games get more important. At least for Team Liquid Challengers down here in the NACL, that has been pretty commonplace for this roster. It happened last year in spring as well. But for Maryville, this team is just really good at all levels. They are really just able to win games on their own. And it can be from anywhere. It can be anybody on the team. They're so mechanically talented. Player of the series is going to go to Spyrax in the mid lane. He's honestly gone a bit under the radar, I think, in terms of the conversation of best mid laners in the NACL so far this year because, I think Scary Jerry and Zyko have taken a lot of the credit. I think UG has also been really good, but Spyrax to me is maybe the best player on this team and certainly one of the best mid laners in the region. He's really good. This guy's been LCS ready for a long time, and even if he did have his bumps last year, even if he wasn't as consistent as maybe I would have liked him to be, as somebody with major expectations of him going into the year for FlyQuest, he definitely finished strong, and I think that that's significantly more important, and he comes over here to Maryville and continues that run of form. I would very much expect Spyrax to continue to get LCS looks as this year continues onwards. I know that there aren't a lot of LCS mid laner spots, and I don't know how many teams are even going to be making changes in the middle of the year. That's not to say that, he definitely deserves a spot over any of the 8 that are already in the league, but at least you have to look at him because he really has been that good. I thought Niles was really good in game number 1. Could have been a bit more aggressive in game 2. Jenkins, I think, actually had a pretty good series on the other side of this, but Niles was really good on TF. He was everywhere on the map, creating a lot of macro advantages. TF is just so strong. The champion is so broken, and honestly, the NACL is watching my videos, I guess, because TF top has been the mainstay in the NACL. There are a lot of regions that have tried him in the bot lane or even mid lane still. I think he's okay mid. I don't think he's quite as strong bot, but he is broken in the top lane where you really do just get a ton of freedom to kind of do whatever you want on champions like that. And, a lot of players have the wherewithal to be able to take advantage of that. And the ones that are really good at him are really able to take over the game like Niles was in game 1 here. Jerry and Zyko are still amazing, and then they're still one of the best bot lanes in the NACL, if not the best bot lane in the NACL. I think they have a really strong case right now to be the #1 bot lane in tier 2 with the performances that they put out. They didn't need to be a focal point here, but Zyko continued to be a big playmaker on the Nautilus, in particular in game 2. It just feels like Maryville is so well-rounded. I know that FlyQuest is the clear favorites for a lot of people. They are, in first place for a reason by themselves, but Maryville is so good, and I think, there's really not an outside chance that they're the best team in the NACL, even though they lost that first series to Fly. But for Team Liquid, you would have loved to see them take a game here, but it's not entirely awful that they weren't able to. Again, Maryville is one of those teams that you have to just be okay losing to because they are that good right now. I think you could point to a couple of weaknesses in terms of where this team ended up going wrong. I gave dud of the series to Kim Down. I've been very unimpressed with this bot lane across the entire year. I'm not going to say I'm super surprised because I think both of these players are rather passive in terms of their mentality. I think Kim Down in particular really thrived towards the end of the year with Arrow when they were both on the same page of being more of that, I don't want to say weak side, but when Arrow wasn't necessarily trying to win all of these fights in the early game, when, you got a little bit more breathing room. And I thought that Spawn would be able to come in and actually fill that role relatively well, but it's just not happened. I give it to Kim Down because I thought he was the most consistently unimpactful across both games, but I think both Roamer and Spawn were worse in game 1. Roamer was awful in game 1, but was really good in game 2 on the Syndra. Very fun mid lane in game 2. The Orianna Syndra matchup is very interesting to watch, and I think both of those players actually played at a super high level, but Roamer was awful in the first game. He was clearly the worst player in game 1, or maybe Spawn was. Spawn was also really bad on the Kai'Sa. Whatever it is, this bot lane in particular is just not working. If you want to give dud of the series to Spawn, I think I could totally accept that. Jenkins and Keel were actually fine in my opinion, specifically Jenkins in game 1 on the Jace, where I thought he was really good going into Niles, who was also very strong, but there's only so much you can do when your bot side is losing as hard as they were in this series, and especially in game 1, it was just over really quickly. Game 2, I think you had more options, but there just really weren't enough, right? Like Spyrax and Jerry were just stronger, and so the carries ended up pushing them forward. But for TL, I'm not going to freak out. This still feels like a top 4 team, especially with their win over Fear looking a lot better going into this week after Fear's series against Supernova. I'm not going to try to make some big statement that this is a top 3 team or anything, even after this loss, but I think in terms of, interesting teams that I expect to get better as we go into playoffs, Team Liquid is always going to be on that list. And then for Maryville, this is just one of the best teams in the league. There really isn't much debate about that anymore. Their only loss this split has been to FlyQuest, who has been untouchable by everybody so far this year. Spyrax and Jerry are one of the scariest carry duos in the entire league, and it's not like UG, Niles, and Zyko are like chumps in terms of secondary supportive players. Niles can carry a game, as we saw in game 1. UG can carry a game, as we saw all of last year. And Zyko's been amazing across this split. I think Maryville is a very dangerous team, and I don't think this should be news to anybody at this point. And then moving on to our second game of day number 2, and it's one that I really didn't expect the outcome of, especially after day number 1. Cincinnati Fear taking on AoE Esports, and AoE picks up a strong 2-1 win, and you know, Fear coming off of a really big win over Supernova. It feels like this team is really peaking at the right time. They felt confident all year long, but I think they are definitely better than what their record would indicate, especially in comparison to a lot of the other middle-tier NACL teams. But AoE is showing up in a big way in this series, getting really consistent down the stretch. Game 2 was domination. Game 3 was pretty in their favor as well, and you've got to give this team a lot of credit. They have gone through the ups and the downs of the season up until this point. There were moments where it's like, I don't think this is a top 8 team. I think they're bottom 2. You know, they were number 9 in my power rankings just 2 weeks ago after they, you know, really hadn't looked good in the middle of the split. But turning things back around, getting back more close to that form that they were showing in like week 2 at the beginning of the year, that's what you wanted to see from AoE. And for Fear, this is definitely a disappointing loss coming off of probably your biggest win of the year up until this point. And that's not really what you want to say. I know this team is going to be a bit more inconsistent just by nature of how the roster is constructed, the play style of the players on the team, but you really wanted to win this one, and you just weren't able to do that. So for AoE, player of the series is going to go to Zamudo in the top lane. Really happy to be able to say that, because I feel like I've been very negative about Zamudo on this channel, and I don't really want to be. Like, I'm not negative about any of the players in the NACL. I think if you play at this level, you obviously deserve to be here. And Zamudo's an interesting player. As I've said in all my primers, all of my, like, big overview videos and not my weekly reviews, you know, I like Zamudo a lot. I think his Feast or Famine playstyle does lend itself more to bad games than maybe some other top laners would. But I do think he has a lot of really good mechanical upside. It just hasn't necessarily come together, in my opinion, for AoE over the course of this year. This is clearly the best series he's played since joining AoE. That Twisted Fate game in Game 2 was amazing. I know the team was just dominating everywhere. Like, Rosethorn was in a really good spot. Onat, Wixie, and Breezy were also in really good spots, and they were able to generate those all basically isolated in their own way. But, you know, the macro is really what pulled them apart, and that's what Zamudo, I think, offered. The TF was really important towards that game, too, and yet another game where TF feels very strong here in the NACL when placed in the top lane. He was still very good on the Aatrox in Game 3, maybe not as good as someone like Onat was on the Nico, but I really wanted to give Zamudo a lot of credit for being as good as he was in this series, especially considering how negative I think I've been to him on this channel. But it was everybody, especially in that second game, which was such a fun one for AoE fans, where if you're really looking for that team to win, Game 2 was really a joy to watch, because they were just able to kind of do whatever they want. They played optimal league in terms of the comp that they drafted for themselves, and I think all of them really impressed. Onat is somebody who I've been really high on this channel. Same thing for both Wixie and Breezy, who have both at times been channel darlings. Breezy in particular is somebody who I've just raved about for years on this channel. But, you know, Rosethorn, I think, is really starting to find some footing here. It really felt like he was not playing all that well. He didn't play well, in my opinion, in his last stop on Golden Guardians, and I didn't think he started this year particularly well on AoE, but this series was really good. I think that piggybacks off of their last win at the end of week number 6, which was also really good for Rosethorn, and you just want to see him continue to get better and more consistent. At 3 and 4, there is a good shot that this team has put themselves in a good position to make playoffs, to make top 8, and Rosethorn's going to be really big for the team in that circumstance. I think seeing Zamudo and Rosethorn both play really well against a good team in Fear is very encouraging for this team moving forward. But for Fear on the other side, again, you really wanted to see this team pick up a 2-0 week, especially after beating Supernova. That was always going to be the harder series, and so to walk out of the easier series with a loss is definitely a bit disappointing. Dead of the series was honestly very difficult, because I don't think anybody played like awful across all 3 games or anything like that. There was nobody who I thought was detrimental entirely, but I'm going to give it to Lens, if only because I just wanted to see him do more. I think you could give this to Philip, who I thought was very inactive, especially down the stretch of this series. Zamudo was just way more, especially in Game 2. I think you could give this to Chad, because he was not good on the Volley Bear in Game 2, lost pressure early, but I thought he was a little bit more active on the Sedge in Game 3. You know, I think there were options, but I ended up with Lens, if only because I think when you do play that style, where bot lane is going to be a little bit more weak side, a little bit more isolated, not expected to be as aggressive, when you fall behind in situations like this, and you're just never really able to stay or get in the game at all, really be involved in any of the positive plays that your team is making, it just doesn't feel particularly good. You don't feel like you're having a huge impact on the game in that sense, and so Lens is going to get it. But again, this felt more like a team loss than an individual player loss. I don't think Lens made some egregious, gigantic mistakes in this series. I think it just kind of was AoE outplaying Fear, specifically in that second game, that they're just going to need to try and wipe from memory. It really is unfortunate that the moment that they were starting to build a lot of this confidence, a lot of this momentum, it does kind of blow itself away here, but, you know, there are positives. I think Toasty had some individual good plays here, even if he wasn't consistent throughout the series, and, you know, I think the same thing for Chad. He had a couple of really interesting engages that I just don't think were enough to be able to pull this game back. He also had a lot of bad plays, so it is worth noting, but Fear simply have to be better as we get into playoffs. You can't have series like this. Once you get to playoffs, you need to be able to beat everybody. We've seen them be able to beat the best teams in the league. They need to be able to beat teams like AoE as well. Hopefully they can learn from this and grow a bit more as we reach the end of the year. But for AoE, this is a big win. It would have been a lot tougher if you're sitting at 2-5. Remember, DSG won earlier in the week. They moved to 2-5. If you were to have lost this series, you're in real danger of being a bottom 2 team going into the final week of the season. AoE, I think, narrowly avoiding that with a win here. It puts them in a much better spot. Not safe or locked by any means, but definitely feeling better about it, especially with the development that we're seeing and the consistency that's being added from some of these players, Rosethorn and Zamudo in particular on the top side, which were question marks. I think there is reason to be optimistic about AoE, who has looked very good at times and not as good at times. I think you're hoping that they can find some sort of balance somewhere in the middle if they can't reach that upper level every single week and try to just get a little bit more consistent. I think this was a good step in that direction. And that's going to bring us to our third and final day of action here in the NACL in week number 7. A pretty important day for all the teams involved, including in this first game between Lit Esports and Disguised, where DSG picks up yet another super important victory to move themselves to 3-5 on the split. Really, really big stuff here. Obviously, their schedule has gotten easier. They played the 2 worst teams in the league, in my opinion, this week, but you'll take your wins anywhere you can get them at this point. Anything to prove that DSG is not a bottom 2 team. You just need to get into the playoffs and start to build some confidence. Honestly, this scheduling might not be all that bad for their confidence. You would love for them to sit here and be in a much better position, a team that I consider to be maybe the best in the entire league coming into the year. You would love for them not even to be on the borderline of being a playoff team, but getting your wins now, feeling like you're generating some momentum and confidence going into some of the most important games that you're going to play in the split is a very important thing to have. For Lit, you know, a lot of the early season magic seems to have rubbed off a bit. This team is still good, and they very much have game plans, and they know how to execute on, you know, what they want to draft. Like, they have a good understanding of win cons, I think, in their games. The problem is just that a lot of the teams in the NACL are a bit more talented than they are at executing those game plans, and unfortunately, they're just not able to win a lot of games. Game 2 was really, really awesome from them. It was a demolition of what DSG has been able to do, but DSG was just a little bit too much down the stretch here, and I want to give them credit for that. So let's talk about it. Player of the series is once again going to go to Tenacity in the top lane. I actually really like how he played this week. He was aggressive. He was taking the game into his own hands. This is what I've wanted to see from Tenacity. I understand that it's against Alorum and Dragoon and not necessarily, you know, Surdy. You know, it's not the same kind of competition. No offense to those guys in the top lane. They're good players, but, you know, he's going to be aiming higher than this. He's an LCS top laner, as he has been in the past, but, you know, this week was a really good showing that, no, this is still the Tenacity that got promoted into the LCS very quickly in the first place. Well, not very quickly, but, you know, proved to be an LCS talent very quickly in his career in the first place. I'm really excited to see him start getting some of that aggressive confidence back. If he's winning his lanes super hard, isolated in 1v1s, and is able to transition that into a lot of skirmishes on the top side, if this team wants to play more for the upper side of the map, I think that only helps DSG. I actually think it's a very good idea for how they like playing the game, mostly because look at how well Manui did in this series, getting to play some of the more standard things. I get it. He looks very good on Hui, and, you know, you want to get him on those things, but Varus was awesome in game 3. The Ziggs was obviously still very good in game number 1. It feels like he is also slowly developing that confidence over and over again. I very narrowly gave Manui player of the series here. I thought he was really good for DSG. Poom obviously comes along with that, although I think he could have been a bit more careful. Perry, I thought, was a really good engager outside of game number 2, where he just wasn't particularly good. That's going to happen. Perry has shown this split that he is adopting a bit more of that feast or famine playstyle that I talk about, win or lose the game. And, you know, there are going to be moments that don't look as good when the rest of the team isn't in a good position, like game number 2, but games 1 and 3 were very solid from him, and Young is just a very consistent mid laner. I've liked him a lot. Maybe not as a superstar at the LCS level, but I think he could definitely hold his own as a very good mid laner in the LCS right now. But Tenacity really breaking out as the best player on this team this week. That's got to be consistent. You have to hope that that's going to be there. Maybe not the best player, because you would hope that, you know, the rest of this team can surpass that, but if Tenacity can play the way that he's playing right now, that's huge. Like, this is a game breaker in the top lane, and that's the big reason I was excited for this team in the first place, and we saw a glimpse of it in week number 7. And then for Lit on the other side, again, I talked about this. This really wasn't a bad series at all from them. All of the games that they lost were close. Maybe not as much game 1, but game 3 was pretty close. They had opportunities to be able to take advantages in that game, and they just weren't able to, and they dominated game number 2. So it's really hard to look at this series and be mad at Lit. Rockboom played amazing in this series as an AD carry, as a hyper carry on Jhin. Even in game number 3, it was very, very fun to watch, and you got to give him credit. He has had some rough games, I think, this split, but he's also had some very good ones. I think it really is dependent on the situation around him. I thought Dragoon was relatively good this series. Again, game number 2 was really fun. That Garen was really fun. Plux was also really solid. Maybe was a little bit over-eager in some circumstances, specifically on the Nautilus in game 1, but I think games 2 and 3 were a lot better from him. Unfortunately, I do have to give a dud of the series, and it has to go to somebody on Lit, and it's gonna be Kisno. I guess it didn't have to, but unfortunately, I think Kisno was the most unimpressive player this series for me, and I really have not been super sold on Kisno. I think he has been a little bit outshined by some of the other junglers at this level, but, you know, I talk about this all the time. This guy has been skyrocketed through the ranks. He has only been playing competitive for about a year, and he's already at the NACL level. Of course, he qualified with this team, but I think we are seeing that there is a bit more growth and development that is necessary from him as we move in to the later part of this year, and, you know, I expect that to happen. I've been pretty high on messages, but I also don't think he was as impactful as he's been in other series. I've praised him for being kind of the light in the darkness in some of their games where things are just going wrong across the map, but he really was not very active in this series, and that's gonna, again, it's gonna happen every once in a while, but you would like to see something different. Overall, I'm really not upset with Lit. I would really hope that this team could make top 8, but it's becoming more and more difficult, especially with DSG winning this series. Lit would have actually been in a pretty interesting spot if they had won game number 3 here, because they would have been above DSG, and there's a real problem if DSG ends up losing that, those final couple series that aren't going to be particularly easy for them, or as easy as this week, but, DSG avoids disaster. They're able to pick up their 3rd win here, and they put themselves out of the bottom 2 spots, which, once again, is really all they're aiming for. You would love to see them generate that confidence that could let them go on a fun little playoff run, maybe even a big playoff run with the talent on this team, but right now, the number 1 goal has to be to stabilize and get into that top 8 in the first place. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, our second series of day number 3, and it's another good one. Wildcard Gaming taking on AOE Esports. And Wildcard is going to pick up a strong 2-1 win here. AOE really building a lot of momentum with that win over Fear just the day before, but Wildcard is a good team, and it really feels like they're getting back to the roots of what got them into such a good position at the beginning of the year before their slide in the middle of the split. For AOE, you would have loved to see them continue a lot of the momentum that they were carrying in that series against Fear, but some of that stayed and some of that went, which is unfortunate. I do think there are still a lot of positives to take away from this series, and right now they are playing like a top 8 team, but Wildcard is better than their record would indicate, just because I think they are starting to get back to the core of their identity, which was, for me, playing through bot lane. I thought bot was really good at the beginning of the year. Doxa was the player that I was really the most intrigued by in the first 3 weeks, not at, saying he was the best player in the league or anything like that, but certainly a player that I thought was overperforming my expectations more than almost anybody else in the entire league. Doxa was awesome in the first couple of games, and being able to play through Aaron as this resource carry, I think, was really good for this team. Again, they got away from it. Quacker was playing well, so they wanted to play for him, but I think this team does play better moving towards the bottom side of the map, and that's exactly what they did here. Aaron's going to get player of the series. I think this is his 2nd in 2 weeks. Really good stuff from him. Nothing bad to say about Wixie and Breezy on the other side of this matchup. We will get into that. Bot lane was certainly a priority for both teams in this matchup, but Aaron, I think, really was exceptional for this team. On the Lucian in game number 2, he really was essential towards how this team wanted to play the mid game and really play out a lot of their advantage-getting moments, their ability to snowball the game out of control. It was really important. And then, of course, on the Jinx, you get a little bit of gold on that champion. She still is a hyper carry. She still can end games very, very quickly. And so, credit to Wildcard for knowing their win condition, knowing how they wanted to play the game, and executing on that in this one with a really, really strong bot lane win. Doxa obviously deserves a lot of credit as well. I've given him a lot of credit. I know I just talked about how I was so impressed with him at the beginning of the split. I think getting back to this bot lane could really unlock him again as a playmaker, and that's what he was in game 3 on the Blitzcrank. A very difficult champion to stop when you're playing from behind, as AoE, I think, learned the hard way, even though game 3 was very close. Just credit to Aaron and Doxa for being able to make that separation. Darkwings continued to look good. He's kind of an interesting case because he's taken such a different role in 2024 than what he has been in previous seasons, which is a resource carry out of the mid lane, somebody you want to give, a lot of investment because he is pretty volatile. He is going to be a bit more aggressive. He's not really been that. He's been much more of that supportive, facilitating mid laner for this team. I think it fits in terms of how they want to play, and I think he is adapting to that style very well, playing low resource on Orianna and on Hui. Like, you can invest in these champions, but, you know, he's not playing the Feast or Famine Yones or whatever that we're seeing some of the other mid laners pull out right now. He's definitely taking more of a secondary carry role, and I think it helps them. Quacker and Winnie weren't perfect in this series. I actually think there were moments where Rosethorn was really good, but Winnie was amazing down the stretch for this team, and so you really want to give him a shout out for that. He also was probably the best player in their Game 2 loss, where they really didn't have any pressure. Winnie was actually trying to create stuff on the volley bear, but that champion's in a really good state. I just think the bot lane is really what I'm excited about when it comes to Wildcard. You know, Aaron and Doxa, I think, have really stepped up for this team this year, and, you know, I love Quacker, I love Darkwings. I think this team could be a sneaky, like, top 5-ish team in the NACL if they can continue to get it together. The performances they've shown so far have actually been pretty good. And then for AoE on the other side, again, you would have loved to see them carry over the win they got from Fear, just as you would have loved to see Fear carry over the win they got from Supernova earlier in the week, but the process once again gets halted at the step. It's just unfortunate. Some of these players did step up again. Big credit to Rosethorn and big credit to Wixie, who I thought continued a lot of the positive development and momentum that they showed in the previous series. Rosethorn in particular, somebody who I have been very critical of. He's had 3 really good series in a row, and that's definitely something I want to make note of on this channel. I definitely don't want it to seem like I'm just going to stick to my guns and, you know, predict the exactly what I predicted a couple weeks ago. If a player shows something different, if they show development, that's the point of the league, and Rosethorn, I think, has gotten better as we've gotten later. I think Wixie was also a pretty good resource carry, never really overstepped his bounds, you know, had a couple of moments where maybe he could have been a bit safer, but outside of that, he was really good this series. I think Breezy had a couple of good moments. Unfortunately, dud of the series for me is going to go to Zamudo in the top lane. It felt like if you're going to pick the Vayne into Darius counterpick, as we've seen in a couple of other regions as well, you got to be successful in it, and you need resources from your team, and he just didn't really get a lot of those, and unfortunately was left out to dry in a couple of situations. I don't think the Vayne worked out in Game 3. I don't think the Aatrox was good in Game number 1, and just as I was hyping him up, he has another series where he is a bit more of a negative, although I think it's significantly less than he had been in a couple of series previous. I still think this is generally an okay week for him. You just would have loved to see him play a bit better in this second series. I think the takeaway for me, though, for AoE is definitely the fact that this team played a lot better this week than they have recently. There have been a lot of interesting moments, I think, especially because Onat, Wixie, and Breezy have been pretty consistent, but Rosethorn, I think, is starting to step up. Zamudo was having much better games, in my opinion, than the middle of the split. I think there's actually reason to be optimistic about AoE, even if the results weren't exactly there, or if the result wasn't exactly there in this series. I just don't know if it's going to be enough. There's a lot of interesting teams in the middle of the pack in the NACL. You know, you've got a team like DSG, you've got a team like Wildcard, you've got teams like Fear. Can I confidently say AoE is better than those teams as we get into playoff series? It's just hard to make that assertion. I do think this should be a top 8 team so long as they don't bottle it towards the back half of the regular season, but I just don't know how much they're going to accomplish once they get there. But for Wildcard, they actually have some upside. I think this team could be similar to a team like Cincinnati Fear. I think they have the same record as them coming out of this week, both sitting at about 500. They have a lot to prove coming into the final week. They haven't exactly been dominant against the good teams, the best teams in the league, but, you know, there is a lot to like about the way that they're playing and the idea that they're starting to figure out the direction that they want to move in. I think for Wildcard, it's all just about focus. It feels like they really found it in this series, and I think bot lane, as long as they're continuing to step up, this is going to be a difficult team and one that nobody is going to want to play, especially in the early rounds of the playoffs. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 7 overview and analysis video here in the spring split up on the screen. Now you're going to see the updated standings after 7 weeks of action. Only 1 week remains, and in fact, it's being played as we speak. It's being ended, essentially, as we speak, and so, you know, you guys will know how this has gone. I haven't, again, yet checked. I wanted to make sure I stayed as out of the loop as possible while still recording this, but these are the standings after 7 weeks. One thing that you'll notice, I'll usually sit here and say, you know, on the right, you can see, you know, the number of power ranking from 1 to 10 for all the teams and the change, how that has changed from last week to this week, but there are no changers. I have not moved anybody after 7 weeks. I think everybody is exactly where they were last week in my eyes. I don't think anybody did enough to change my opinions. Some teams have changed standings, like Wildcard moving up to 4th, and, you know, obviously DSG moving out of the bottom 2, I think are pretty important milestones, but I really don't feel all that different about any of these teams at the current moment. I think all of them are in kind of flux, I think is the best way to put it, but you know, we can talk about them. I think FlyQuest and Maryville, like I said, are pretty clear top 2. Supernova, I said, would have been in that conversation, but did falter a bit this week, which is a bit concerning. I still have Team Liquid at 4. I think their loss to Maryville isn't that bad, and I think they're going to figure things out, but Fear at 5, DSG at 6. I mean, DSG has done what they're supposed to do, beat the teams that they're supposed to beat. Obviously, you would love for them to close out the season hot, and I think it's definitely possible, but I need to see it to believe it, and then Wildcard at 7, AoE at 8. Those round out the teams that I expect to make playoffs, and unfortunately, Lit on this 5-series series losing streak and Mirage are just not there for me. The two teams that ended up qualifying through the qualifiers last year, unfortunately at the bottom of the standings, which is a bit unfortunate. But let me know if you guys think I should have made any changes to the power rankings, if any of these teams are in spots that you wouldn't expect them to be in. I would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. But of course, it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 7. Player of the week was a super easy conversation for me. It's Tenacity, the top laner for DSG. This team really fired back this week. I know they played the bottom two teams, but Tenacity dominated both of these series, looked really good in every game that they played. And to me, it's just so important for him to stay on the right track. If he can continue to be the dominant force that this team can play through, or maybe not even play through, but just have that kind of pressure on the top side of the map while you spend resources elsewhere, maybe on Manui, maybe on Young, wherever else, Perry, wherever else you want to put those resources. I think having someone like Tenacity playing the way that he did this week on the top side is super important towards what they do. The honorable mentions for me, Spyrax, the mid laner for Maryville, really good series from him. He just continues to look amazing for that team. And then Toasty, even though Fear lost their second series, he was definitely the best player in both of those for me, and he's really impressed me. He has had a really, really good rookie split here in the NACL. Unfortunately, dud of the week has to go to someone, and it's to somebody that I've just praised basically endlessly on this channel. It's going to be Kenvi, the jungler for Supernova. I'm not worried that he's going to be here more often. Like, I'm not thinking this is some sort of downturn, but when you only play one series a week and that series isn't particularly good, then you're unfortunately dud of the week, and that's what it was for Kenvi. Again, he's been one of, if not the best jungler in the league for most of this year, and I would expect him to be fine. I expect to be walking out of week 8 in a really good spot with Supernova and a really good spot with Kenvi. It just wasn't a good series against Fear, and that's going to happen every once in a while when you are the primary driving force for the resources that your team is able to generate, like Kenvi has been for Supernova for a lot of this year. I do think there are going to be situations where you're going to be a little less effective if that player isn't 100% on, as we saw in this series. But again, I wouldn't expect this to continue. Kenvi has been phenomenal, but Kenvi is dud of the week here in week 7, and Tenacity is player of the week. But let me know what you guys thought of everything down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, if you enjoyed this week, leave a like on the video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions as well: LCS, LEC, LCK, LPL, every single week on this channel. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.